Taking the High Road podcast, presented to you by Divorce Buddy and Certified Divorce Coach. Welcome to the show. In the Taking the High Road podcast, you'll learn simple strategies for creating a healthy divorce no matter what stage you are at. This podcast also has a companion book available from Amazon.com that includes valuable insights from 11 certified divorce coaches. To learn more, be sure to visit highroadanddivorce.com. Again, that's highroadanddivorce.com. In today's broadcast, we're going to be talking to Tracy Callahan. Tracy is a CDC Certified Divorce Coach, and she's going to be talking about self-empowerment through decision-making, why decision-making is a primary factor in the divorce process, and how it can be greatly impacted by time, emotion, and change and transition. So with that, I'd like to introduce Tracy Callahan. Hi, Tracy. How are you doing today?
Good. How are you, Jeremy?
I'm doing great. Thank you, Tracy. Now, I know you're going to talk to us about self-empowerment through effective decision-making, really moving from action to agreement in the divorce process. So maybe if you could just share a little bit about your background and how you got into this field.
Sure. Well, I am a certified divorce coach, a CDC Certified Divorce Coach, and I'm also a Supreme Court Certified Family Mediator and Divorce Mediator. And I got into the field about 7 years ago, and I started actually mediating and doing mostly criminal cases, some civil work, and family, but really had a true passion for family work. My background is actually in healthcare administration, so I'm not an attorney, but was absolutely fascinated with the concept of conflict and how conflict affected individuals, and started mediating in New York. I did a lot of community work as well as court work. And then I moved to states and became a Florida Supreme Court Certified Family and Divorce Mediator, and really was impacted by how many people, potential clients, were reaching out to me who had a lot of questions, more beyond my ability to answer as a neutral facilitator, as a mediator, but was really eager and striving for answers to questions they had about the process and what should they do and how should they do it. And they felt very alone and scared. And I had done some conflict coaching previously, but really wanted to find an avenue to be able to support these individuals. And I then looked and sought out the field of divorce coaching and found the CDC, which is the only certifying body for divorce coaches in the United States, and went through the coursework and became certified. And most of the work that I do is really working primarily with women. My target market is women in their 40s who had careers or professional background and left their careers to raise their family, raise their children, and then found themselves either in the process of getting divorced or making the decision whether they wanted to get divorced, the should I or shouldn't I question. And really have been working heavily in the arena of divorce coaching and working with these clients, and also preparing clients for mediation. As a certified mediator, I'm very conversant on the topic and know what's involved, and really do a lot of work with individuals and helping them get ready for the process.
Now, you talk a lot about self-empowerment through effective decision-making. So maybe share with us a little bit about the decision-making process in divorce.
Sure. Well, I mean, as I'm sure you're aware, divorce is one of the hardest decisions that people ever have to make or face, whether you're thinking about getting a divorce or responding to a divorce. People are embarking on a journey that can be really scary and difficult and unknown. But that journey doesn't necessarily have to be filled with so much conflict and uncertainty, and it certainly doesn't need to be alone. Being immediately thrown into a process where decisions need to be made, individuals feel extremely pressured and overwhelmed. Although we make decisions every single day of our lives, like what will we eat for breakfast, or what time do we wake up, or where we need to be at a certain time, Divorce is very different, mostly because it requires us to make decisions when we feel less equipped to do so. And also the stakes are extremely high in the process.
Now, in the context of divorce, there are a lot of decisions that people have to make. So maybe talk to us a bit about that decision-making process and what sort of decisions people do have to make.
Well, decision-making is basically a cognitive process, but in divorce, it's saturated with lots of emotions and makes it even more challenging. This is specifically true in divorce, where decisions made during this time can have lasting impact and consequences. So in the process of making those decisions, really we're engaging in this process, a selection of a belief or a course of action that require us to explore lots of different alternatives or possibilities, like what am I going to do? And the list of questions that are confronted right away can be extremely overwhelming. Everything from what do I do now, what do I want, where am I now, where do I see myself, what are my options, what am I ready to decide, who will support me in making these decisions. They're overwhelming. And one of the most typical things that happens is, that immediate what's my next step, what do I do? Whether that's I was just served papers and my spouse wants a divorce, or I'm thinking that I need to leave my marriage and I want a divorce. So always that next thing is what do I do? And that can be extremely overwhelming for individuals.
Right. Clearly, divorce is a very stressful time and it can be overwhelming. There's obviously a lot of pressure to make the right decision. So maybe tell me a bit more about that process for your clients.
Well, the landscape of divorce, it's very interesting because it's sort of multi-layered. It's a time of change and transition where we're redefining everything that we know it to be true, whether that's our family or friends or housing or finances. It's also a very intense emotional time where there's lots of feelings, for example, denial, shame, anger, frustration, helplessness. And then you sort of have that all coupled with this legal process that has its own language, its intricacies, difficulties, and stressors. So in that process, having to put all of those things together, you're starting to then complicate this decision-making process and making a decision about how to proceed. When we make decisions, it's really kind of scientific, actually. There's really this process, So we typically set goals, we gather information about what we need to do, we brainstorm alternatives, we sort of assess those alternatives, and then we take action. And all of that stuff, it seems like very separate steps, but they all sort of happen together. And as we were talking about sort of that first big choice is really what process do I want to engage in from the legal aspect. There's so many different options available to people getting divorced these days, everything from your traditional representation where each party has their own attorney, to a very contentious litigated process that actually goes to a trial. We see that in child custody hearings where the judge is the person who makes the decision as to most aspects of the divorce settlement. Collaborative divorce, which is a really new arena out there, which sort of both parties are working with similar attorneys who have similar goals, that are representing the clients, but really working more together in terms of a more peaceful, cooperative agreement. And then there's mediation, which, as I'm a mediator, I absolutely am a true believer of mediation, where the two parties are there, the husband and the wife, and they sit down with a neutral facilitator to work out a settlement agreement. And mediation, there's two different levels of mediation where you can mediate with each party having their own attorney, and then the facilitator the mediator is still facilitating the negotiated agreement between the two parties. or pro se mediation, which is where the parties are there by themselves and working with the mediator to come up with their settlement agreements. And lastly, there's sort of a new arena that certain states have, not all states, but sort of a do-it-yourself model where you can access forms. Florida is a perfect example of this, that you can download the required forms. You literally just fill in the forms, and you can bring it down and complete your settlement agreement with your spouse and walk it to the county clerk's office and file for your divorce. And all of those decisions really are the first big decisions. Aside from how do we tell our children, it's sort of, if there are children involved, that's really that next best, that big question that needs to be made.
Now, what would you say is the best way for people to navigate this often confusing and overwhelming process?
Well, it's really, the most important thing is to identify the decisions that need to be made. Sometimes when individuals are confronted in these very situations of divorce, it's an extremely overwhelming process, and there's this confluence of decisions that need to be made. They're sort of all swarming around you. So the biggest first step is to really identify what decisions need to be made, either to prioritize them or to start pulling out the threads, if you will, if it was a quilt, and not looking at everything in one big overwhelming process, but starting to prioritize or making decisions one at a time. The second really important thing for people to begin the process is to take the time that you need, to not rush into the process. Typically, people feel very pressured and overwhelmed, so they start engaging in a decision-making process that they might regret, or because they felt pressured to do so, or they were just happy, they just wanted to make a decision because they couldn't deal with it. So instead of avoiding the process, they just make a decision to just get themselves out of it. So really taking the time that they need. Framing the problem, which means putting the issues into context, not out of fear. Sometimes we make decisions out of fear or status. For example, an issue that I constantly get presented from my clients with is this: what should I do with the house, the family home? And decisions are often, the problem is really not necessarily what to do with the home. So it's really about framing it, putting the issues into context, and not being afraid to understand what the true decision is. The next step would be to really find people, experts that can help you with the information that you need, and to educate yourself to the process. So typically when clients come to me and they're very overwhelmed and they don't know what process is best for them, whether they should hire an attorney, whether they should seek a traditional method, whether mediation is the right decision for them, it's really about educating themselves. Speaking with mediators, speaking with attorneys, learning about the process, learning about the law, and understanding and identifying people that can give them the support that they need. For example, an attorney, a certified divorce financial analyst, a divorce coach, a therapist, a support group, any person that they can find to seek out who might be able to assist them in giving them the information that they need to be able to make the decisions that they have to make.
Now, would you say that by taking action and engaging in effective decision-making, even if it's challenging, you have more of a feeling of confidence?
Absolutely. So no matter how small, no matter whether it's one decision, a very small decision, for example, how are we going to share our time with our children while we're living in the house and nobody's moved out yet? These small decision-making processes give you the confidence, and that's really what we call this process of self-empowerment. Taking charge of your own life, knowing and owning your own power without giving it away. And the more you can take those small steps and build upon them on foundation, the easier it is to then make the next decision. It's kind of like taking that first step. Once you take the step and you didn't fall down, no matter how small of a step it was, it gives you the confidence to take the next step. And it's truly a building block process where people then are engaging in the more difficult decisions and having the confidence in their ability to engage in the decision-making process and not to be afraid. So to be able to own their own power without giving that process away or saying, well, my husband or my wife always dealt with that, therefore I can't deal with it. Be able to engage in that decision-making process, exert oneself, and to be authentic, really, to be able to be true to yourself. That's really what we're talking about in terms of confidence.
Now, maybe just elaborate a little bit on the process of self-empowerment. How would you define, or what is self-empowerment?
Right. So self-empowerment is basically, in the simplest form, taking charge of your own life. It's really the concept of, if we were talking about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the tippy top of it, the top triangle, that self-actualization. And I think so much what happens to people in the divorce process is the divorce starts defining the individual instead of the individual defining the process. And the more that you could take charge of the process in divorce specifically, you're self-empowering yourself and you're not allowing something else to take over you. And part of that self-actualization, that self-empowerment, is having decision-making power of your own, to not say and let other people make the decisions. As a mediator, I personally believe mediation to be extremely self-empowering for many individuals because they're the ones engaging in the decision-making process. They're the ones verbalizing for themselves what's important to them. It is a skill and it is a negotiation, and it takes a certain level of confidence for sure. But that's the ultimate step, the self-empowerment, where you're engaging in that process and not having somebody else engage, or not having a judge tell you what will happen in your divorce, what your family will look like in your divorce, what your assets and debts will look like in your divorce, instead engaging in that process together.
Okay, so let's talk about the self-empowered decision-making process. How a self-empowered decision-making process takes one from action to agreement in one's divorce.
Yeah, so ultimately in divorce, the end goal is agreement. In divorce, the end agreement is a settlement agreement that's either, that's sanctioned by the court. So even if it was a mediated agreement, it still needs to go through the legal process and be granted or so ordered by the judge. But it's really, we engage in agreements all the time. Agreements with ourselves, agreements with our children, agreements with our spouse, an agreement in the divorce. By taking the action and taking the steps to make the decisions needed for you in the process, you are ultimately taking that self-empowered decision-making, moving into action with the end goal of an agreement in the divorce process, whether that's ultimately your divorce settlement or an agreement with yourself and how you're going to continue to proceed in your divorce, what you want this to look like, what you'd like to profess to your family, to your children, and to yourself.
Well, that's interesting, Tracy. Now maybe share an example of a client that you've worked with and some of the challenges that they were going through and how you helped them come through to a resolution and overcame some of those more common pitfalls.
Sure. So, for example, I have a client right now who was not engaged in any financial decisions in the household. This is a very typical scenario, which is okay and normal, because what we do sometimes in relationships is we sort of divide and conquer tasks and roles, and we all have assigned responsibilities, whether that's inadvertently or advertently. So, for example, this one client was not engaged in any financial decision-making whatsoever. And actually, the financial decision-making process scared her to death. So when she was presented with the fact that, her husband wanted to end their marriage and get divorced, There was a lot of fear in terms of, I don't know anything. She didn't even know whether there was a mortgage on the house. She didn't know what the balances of the credit cards were, so she felt extremely overwhelmed by the process and was confronted with having to make immediate decisions. That there was not, that he moved out and she was left with a stack of bills and a stack of responsibilities from the financial management of their home that she had never engaged in. So, that process for her was extremely overwhelming, and she was scared and she didn't know what to do. And we sort of sorted it out. So we were able to sort of take the process, break it down, identify what the priorities were. She was able to then make decisions on which things need to be dealt with immediately, the information that she needed to seek out. She was able to set some goals, gather that information, talk about alternatives. If I did this with that, how is it going to look? If I needed to ask for this, what does that look like? And then she was able to confidently make some decisions on her own. And even something as small as figuring out what the balance of the mortgage was, figuring out where the accounts were, and making those decisions on how she was going to handle it, empowered her. So when she did go into mediation, she was extremely equipped. And her husband was really quite taken aback by the process because she had always been a non-participant in the process. And I think she felt sort of bullied by him at first, that he had all the information, that he was the one who was making decisions because she wasn't empowered to make them. And when she started exerting herself and demonstrating her confidence and knowledge, she educated herself. She got the information she needed. She sought the expert advice that she needed. She got the support that she needed. She was able to engage in a powerful process for her by making decisions. The more she engaged in the decision-making process, the easier it was for her to be able to come to a settlement agreement that she felt very confident about and that she felt was very fair, and she felt that had less conflict than it had in the numerous years of their marriage when she basically avoided it and did not engage in the process.
So Tracy, why don't you share with us what some of the key benefits are of pursuing mediation versus a litigated divorce?
Well, I'm obviously a proponent of mediation as a mediator. I believe that people are best equipped to deal with their own lives versus somebody else. For example, a judge or attorneys negotiating on your own behalf. We sort of come into marriages on our own, making decisions and setting roles and processes that we do. So when then we are coming to end our marriage, that we're the best people to make a determination about what that looks like, especially when there's children involved. I am a child-centered mediator. So I believe that decisions that are made in mediation should always be centrally focused on what's in the best interest of the children. No matter what, family will always be family. And the more in mediation, because the bottom line is you still have to communicate unless you don't have children. If you have children, you will continuously be connected with this other person as a family for the rest of your children's lives. And mediation is really an opportunity to use this as a vehicle for communicating and decision-making and negotiating and being able to have those honest conversations with one another. So there's tremendous benefits in mediation where you're engaging in that decision-making process. Both individuals are making the decision what this is going to look like, how to move forward, and how we're going to do this together.
Right, because who knows better than you and your ex-spouse about your family? Does the judge know, or do you guys?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know what's best. You know the needs of your children. You know what the interests of your children are. It's really an opportunity for people to share. I know this whole Gwyneth Paltrow, Chris Martin, conscious uncoupling, but it truly, that is what mediation is to a certain degree. It's about sitting there and being honest with one another and talking about how to make the transition happen together, and how to communicate in what's in the best interest of everybody together.
Tracy, any final words of advice, or if there's one lesson that you think that everybody should take from this, what would that be?
That we can't control anybody's behavior. We could only control our reaction to their behavior. And I say that in regard to everything from the divorce process to decision-making process. We, as individuals, have an opportunity to define who we want to be in the process. We might not be able to control the situation. We might not be able to control somebody else's behavior, but we take responsibility for ourselves. Again, that whole concept of self-empowerment and self-actualization, where I am defining how I choose to behave in this situation, how I choose to handle this situation, how I choose to proceed and move forward, regardless of what and how other people behave. So we can only control ourselves. And the more that we tap into what's important to us, who we are, who we'd like to be, and not letting even something as difficult as divorce define that process for us, we're so much better off in the long run.
Yeah, that's great advice, and something that we should always take into consideration. Too often people forget that we don't have control over other people's actions, but we do have control over our own reactions and our own actions.
And that's truly taking the high road to divorce. You know, we can't control the divorce process, but we can control how we handle and how we perceive and how we view the divorce process.
Well, thanks so much, Tracy. It was great talking to you. Now, in closing, can you share with the audience or the listeners how they can get in touch with you?
Yeah, you can reach me on Facebook at Mediating Matters. My company is called Mediating Matters. I don't think I mentioned that earlier. You can reach me on Twitter at Mediating Matter, and my website, www.mediating/matters.com.
Well, thanks again, Tracy. Really enjoyed the conversation.
Thanks, Jeremy.
Thank you for joining us today on the Taking the High Road podcast. Be sure to stay tuned for the next episode, and if you're interested in learning more about the companion book available from Amazon, visit highroadindivorce.com. Again, that's highroadindivorce.com. Thanks again.